All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to today's web conference. You've joined us for the Dynamics 365 FastTrack Tech Talk. Today's topic is performance optimization. My name is Debbie and I will be your moderator today. We are recording this web conference on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. If you do not consent to being part of a recorded session, please disconnect your browser at this time. The attendees can access the web conference recording at the same registration site within 24 hours. We encourage you to use the messages panel today at any time to ask questions regarding content or to request support. Pardon me. To do so, please click on the messages button, at the bottom of your screen. Type your question into the white box and click on send. Our presenters today will be responding to your questions as they come up, and we'll save some time at the end to do a recap. Our production team strives to be a leader in delivering online content. Please help us reach this goal by providing feedback. At the end of today's session, a survey URL will appear in the messages window. We ask that you please click that link, enter your email, and select the appropriate responses. Thank you for your support. With that, I appreciate your patience during our announcements. You're going to hear a brief pause while I start my recording. Hello and welcome to today's web conference. This is the Dynamics 365 FastTrack Tech Talk. Today's topic is performance optimization. Presenting with us from Microsoft today, we have two senior FastTrack program managers. We have Alok Singh, and we also have Pedro Sacramento. And now it is my pleasure to hand you over to your first speaker. Alok, you now have the floor.
Thanks, Debbie. Thanks, everyone, for joining this session, and we are really happy to once again do the Performance Optimization Tech Talk in this new series of Tech Talks for this year. And once again, thanks for joining this, and I also have my colleague and friend Pedro with me, who will be assisting me, and he'll be taking care of some of the areas of this presentation. So to get started, it is just this has always been an interesting area for our partners and customers, performance optimization, and that's one of the as FastTrack program managers working with our customers, we've seen that this is one of those topics that frequently comes up, and we get significant amount of feedback and inputs on performance. So the goal today really is to talk about the performance optimization, what can be done from an architect perspective, from a developer perspective, and also a solution designer perspective to think about performance of your Dynamics 365 SaaS application, and which are the areas where what are the key factors that you need to consider beforehand, maybe even before you start building out the solution, and before deploying, to know about and be aware of that can have a significant impact on the performance for your end users. So with that, I'll just jump into our objectives. So the primary goal is to provide you the knowledge and the best practices on how to have a performant Dynamics 365 solution, and we'll talk a little bit more about performance in general, what should be the approach towards performance, and then we will look at the optimization areas, starting from the client connectivity to optimizations that you can do within the solution, and also the code optimizations that can be done to have a well-performing system. And finally, we'll just conclude with what are the areas that we discussed, and in terms of the outcomes and takeaways for you to have a good performing Dynamics solution. So with that, I'll just move into the performance overview area. When it comes to SaaS services, I think a lot of, and this has come up in previous discussions, and I think many of our customers and partners come with some perceptions about SaaS services in general, and especially when we say it's a cloud service. So the first thing is that it should be almost an infinite scale. No matter what I do, no matter what I throw at this platform, it's still supposed to perform because it auto scales. So which to an extent, it is true that we have scaling as a platform. It can take a significant amount of load and it can adjust based on the requirements. But having said that, there are still things that can be done and that are still within the realm of the solution and the code that's written on the platform that can guide the level of performance that you get out of it. So even though it's true that there is auto scaling, it's not an infinite scale, and there are a lot of factors that come into play even with SaaS services. The other perception that we hear is it's a SaaS service which is just deployed elsewhere. I don't have any control over the infrastructure or the underlying platform to do any of the optimizations. So if my form is taking 10 seconds to load, then there's nothing that, as a developer or as an architect, there's nothing that I can do about it, because it's the platform that's supposed to take care of the loading times, etc. So yes, while it's true that the platform is deployed and managed elsewhere and managed by Microsoft, there are still a lot of things that can be done to optimize it and to make sure that your end users are getting an optimal experience with the application. So those just wanted to address some of the common things that I hear and the perceptions that a lot of people come with when it comes to cloud SaaS services. So when we talk about improving performance or having a performant implementation of Dynamics 365, some of the key factors, like any other application, would be how the design is the design taking care of performance, and irrespective of whether it's a SaaS application or it's an application that you are deploying and installing within your own data center, there are aspects of design that can come into play, which are extremely critical for getting good performance. There's also the code efficiency. So just because it's a SaaS service that can scale, it doesn't mean that a bad code is still going to perform well in cloud. So the issues with code still need to be addressed, and your code needs to be written in an efficient way for it to perform well. And finally, we should also look at reliability of network, and usually this is one of those new areas where if a customer has always had their local private cloud or a data center internally where the applications are deployed, typically network doesn't come as a major challenge because the latency would be really low, and that's not a factor that's taken into consideration. But with cloud services, some of that changes, and we'll talk about how that's a new aspect that your IT needs to worry about before you're deploying your SaaS solution. And finally, we'll also talk about what is the approach that we should be taking with performance optimization, where there are bottlenecks at various stages, but the approach that we recommend is take a top-down approach to performance optimization, where we start with the user experience and then work towards the solution and the platform to make sure that everything works well at different stages of your solution. So with that, I'll just quickly go into the performance overview area. So like I mentioned, we should always start with the client. So look at the experience that's closest to your end user, right? Whether it might be the machine or the thin client where the user is working with. Is that being optimized, and does that meet all the requirements? And then the next thing that's sitting between the end user and your application or the service is the network. So the latency and the bandwidth there, these are very, very critical to ensure that the user is getting a responsive system that's performing optimally for their requirements. And we'll talk a little bit about how there are some basic tools like Fiddler and basic browser debugging that can help you identify some of these issues if there are, and also we'll talk about the performance center where you can analyze the latency numbers, etc., for your end users to make sure that things are taken care from a client perspective and client and network perspective. The second step of optimization would focus on the platform. So if a user is, let's say, trying to create a case, is the operation from let's say the web interface or from the mobile app taking the same amount of time when you're trying to do it through the SDK or through an API call? How much time is actually taken by the platform to perform that specific operation? So analyzing things from both the perspectives, from an end user UI perspective and from a platform perspective, how much time it's taking can give you some good idea in terms of where the issue is. And the important factor is to also look at the location where your users are. If you have users located in different offices or located across different regions in the world, whereas your instance is in a different region, then this can have a major impact on performance because the latency will vary for each of these users based on where they are. And it's not just the data center location, but also many a times the local office network that can have an impact, the proxy settings, etc. So we'll discuss some of those, though we'll not go into deeper network optimization as a part of this tech talk. The other factor is to evaluate the plugins and the workflows. So a lot of automations and the extensions that we do on our platform can also impact the performance. If you have a synchronous plugin that's taking let's say 30 seconds, then that's going to cause an issue because the user interface at the save operation would be frozen for that time, and at the end what you're rendering is a non-responsive UI to your end users, which is not good from a performance standpoint. And also the perception is that this is a slow system which doesn't respond. So it's really important to look at those extensions and the customizations that we have done on top of the platform and how they impact the end user experience. To give an example of that, and this is again something that I've seen with my previous customer, is there was a plugin, a synchronous plugin that would update some of the related records. When let's say a field on the account was updated, the related contacts would automatically be updated. And this worked fine because when it was initially developed, this was tested with a scenario where there was one account with 2 or 3 related contacts, and it worked fine. But once this solution or this plugin was deployed to production, they were running into scenarios where some accounts had, let's say, 500 contacts or 1,000 contacts, and that's where we started seeing failures, or this thing that was working fine with 2 or 3 related contacts suddenly started to fail. So it's really important to look at some of the automations that we build on the platform and see how well they'll scale for our scenarios, and also have an idea of the scale and the number of records that it's going to operate on. So that's a very important step from a platform standpoint. And then we look at the database. So the underlying database, I think some of the key bottlenecks that we have seen is related to security models. So if you're creating security roles for, let's say, if you have 200 security roles within your system and a very, very complex security requirement where you're assigning 20 different types of security roles to each of these users, then the computation that happens in the backend whenever a user is accessing a record or even trying to read a record is really complex, where it has to be a union of all of these security roles, and the decision time required to analyze whether the user has access to this record or not is really high. So that's something that we should take into consideration. And a simple way to analyze this would be, is the system behaving the same way when an admin user or an org level permission, a user with org level permission, is accessing or performing their operation? And is it different if there's a specific business user with a specific set of security roles performing the same operation? So that's again one of the areas where we can optimize and see how we can consolidate the security roles and relook at them to maybe optimize the overall security design a little bit. And again, from a database perspective, as you maybe after the data migration, once you have imported, let's say, 1 million records, or even after as your system begins to grow over a period of time, there might be some indexing requirements because the queries would take longer. Obviously, if you have one TB of database size or even smaller, so it's really important to analyze some of these queries and help with the indexing. And a lot of this can be done, working with your your FastTrack program managers and also with Microsoft support. But there are also tools that we're exposing, like the data performance monitor, where it can be done by the end user. So okay, I think there's a question there. Let's take a quick look. Is Access Teams the same as Teams? Are there different types of teams? Yes, there are different types of teams, and that can also have an impact on performance based on the caching that happens in the backend. So if you're using Access Teams, they're basically lightweight teams that have lesser impact on performance because every time that you're using a owner team or the standard team structure that we have, there is a lot of caching that happens, but every time you change, you make any changes to your team, the cache is invalidated. So based on the type of team that you're using, that can also have an impact on performance. So those are the key types of teams: the owner teams and the access teams. So does that answer the question, Robert, or was there anything more specific that you wanted to know? Anyways, just type it in if you have any other follow-up questions, and we can address that. Okay, so just to move ahead and talk about the client connectivity aspect of it. So this was the first area that we wanted to cover in our performance optimization talk, was the client connectivity, and this is one of the biggest bottlenecks that we have seen in terms of our experience. This is the first issue, or the first thing to look at would be this: whenever you hear from your users that they are complaining of performance or the responsiveness is poor of their application. So I think this is just a diagram that shows where our data centers are located, because the physical location of where the data center is, where your application and your data is residing, and the location of where your users are accessing it from can play a key role in the performance and the responsiveness of the application. So we have seen multiple examples where the data center might be in Europe somewhere, so the application is hosted and all of the data is in Europe, but the users are trying to access this in China or in maybe different regions of Asia. But this can have a significant impact on the performance, because if we look at the latency, usually we have seen that it can be more than 300 milliseconds. If you're talking about 350 millisecond latency between Europe and the user sitting in China, there is no way that they're going to have a system that's responsive. The forms will take really long time to load, and you wouldn't expect the users in China to really adopt a solution like that, where a form takes 10 seconds to load, right? So it's a very, and what I really suggest customers is to kind of create a map, a simple matrix of what are the regions or the locations from where the users will be accessing the instance, and how would the latency be for each of those regions. So if your users are globally distributed, you might try placing your instance again based on the compliance and whatever the regulatory requirements that you have to meet. You might choose to deploy your instance maybe in a region within the United States or somewhere in Europe that can maybe give a more balanced approach for your users in different geographies. Because if you try to put your data very close to one set of users, the users who are far away might have an experience where the system is almost unusable. So trying to find an optimal location of where you should host your instance can have a significant impact and can make or break your application, because the end users will not be comfortable if it is placed in a region that's extremely high in terms of latency. So that's one pre-exercise that we highly recommend. Look at all the possible data center locations and your user locations and try to map them out as to which is the most optimal in terms of latency. And many a times, it's difficult to come up with a solution where one instance may not be ideal for geographically distributed users. So you might even consider the strategy of having more than one instances deployed. So maybe different systems and and try to replicate the data and report from different instances if there is lesser dependency of these users working on the same data set. But that's again a different conversation that can impact your overall project. So if you have these challenges, and if you're doing a broader geo deployment where you have users across the world, work with your FastTrack program managers, and they can provide you the right kind of recommendations or the choices that you might have to provide an optimal experience to all of those users. That's one key area when it comes to network performance. So what are the various factors that come into play? Now, obviously, once you have made the choice, and once the data center is chosen and your instance is set up, there are still other areas that can be optimized to improve the performance, right? So because the latency or the delays are added at various levels, so we have seen that within the branch offices and just the corporate network can add maybe 100 milliseconds, which is a significant amount of delay if you consider users who might be sitting in Asia. So there is the 200 millisecond latency just because of their geographical location. But if your corporate network itself is adding another 100 or 150 milliseconds to it, then that's just almost making it unusable for the end users. So optimizing the traffic or reducing the latency within the corporate network and within your branch offices can help. And now there are other services which are, you can work with your IT or your networking teams, and also, utilize some of the premier services related to network optimization. But that we have seen that can really help reduce the latency. The other area where we might get some improvement is the routing from your ISP. So you can work closely with your ISP to ensure that they are efficiently routing the data from your offices to the Microsoft data center. And there are tools that are available today, from our Azure team, the Azure networking network monitoring tools, or there are other third-party tools like the Thousand Eyes that can really help you analyze in terms of how many hops does it take for from a user's location to reach the Microsoft data center, and what is the latency at each of those hops. So you can work closely with your the IT team or the network team within your organization and with your ISP to really try and reduce that latency and optimize the routing to the Microsoft data centers. So that's really one of the pre-work that we would recommend to make sure that when you're deploying your Dynamics 365 solution, your users don't run into the performance issues caused by high latency or even low bandwidth. So that's a pre-exercise that's highly recommended. And if you need more details, feel free to raise this and discuss this with your FastTrack program managers. So I hope that provides some clarity around looking at the network and client connectivity. If you have any questions, again, feel free to put them in the chat window, and we'll try and address those for you. So in terms of the tooling that we have, and again, this is just as simple as just going to the diagnostics URL there, and you can see some of the basic metrics in terms of it performs a latency test to see how many milliseconds is the latency to reach your data center, and anything under 150 is acceptable. Now, if you can keep it below 100, 50, 60, that's really good. But for an acceptable performance, we recommend that this has to be under 150 milliseconds. Anything above 150 milliseconds, your users are not going to be able to use the application, and the experience is not going to be optimal at all. So that's one thing where you can easily test it out, and the initial exercise that I mentioned around analyzing the latency from different regions for your user locations, you can simply use this diagnostic page to analyze for your users in different locations how is the latency going to look like, even before you deploy or go and set up your instance in one of those data centers. And again, the bandwidth is that it has to be at least 400 kbps for each user. So understand in terms of how many users would be working from that specific location, and what is the kind of bandwidth that you'll need to set up for your users in that office location. So these are the two key factors that you can very easily measure through our diagnostic tool and plan your deployment accordingly. There are some other metrics here which have more to do with the the JavaScript processing, etc., which is based on your browser and how your browser processes some of these client-side scripts, etc. So those can also be helpful for you to analyze which browser works best for you, and you can play with different browsers for to choose the one that works best for your end users. So that's around the client connectivity and how you can test it out for yourself. The other aspect is caching. Now, what we have seen is, many a times that Dynamics tries to cache as much as possible. The static resources are cached at the client side to ensure that you avoid the calls to reload them and download them every time the user is making a request. So the code loads in general when the user is making the first requests is usually slower, but as they've used the system for some time and all the cache is all the static resources are already cached, the performance can improve considerably. So it might be important to ensure that your internal browser settings and your group policies are not set such that it leads to a code load every time. So your caching policy should be set appropriately. Even within the proxy, you should make sure that the proxy doesn't change the headers to avoid or to stop from the browser from caching some of these components. So you can simply use Fiddler to analyze what is being cached and what is being requested every single time, and this might be a good starting point to understand whether any of your browser pilot policies or other group policies imposed by your IT are impacting the cache performance or not. This is another area where it's through a simple change with your policies, you can greatly improve performance. So I think with that we looked at the client optimizations and performance in general. What is our approach towards it? And now I'm going to pass it on to my colleague Pedro, who will talk about the solution optimization, the code optimizations, and some of the other areas of what you can do to have a performant Dynamics 365 solution. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat window, and we'll answer them either during the presentation or we'll take them in the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Alok. So the next level on that top-down approach that Alok was just explaining about it will be the solution optimizations. Just pausing there for a minute just to check if there are any questions regarding client optimization before we go to the solution part. Okay. So if there are no questions about client optimizations, so the next layer, as I was explaining, would be the solution optimization. So in this area, we will focus on what kind of issues can occur regarding or related with performance, about the kind of changes on your solutions or from your ISVs that are done during your deployment. So adjusting the out-of-the-box environment to your scenario or your needs or your requirements. Al, can you confirm if you can see the screen?
Yeah, I can see the solution optimization screen.
Okay.
Still.
Yeah. Can you take control and change to the next slide?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Hey guys, I can take over as well. Oh, there we go. I see slide 12. Yep.
Yeah, okay. I cannot see it, but... Okay, so slide 12, what we have is the improving quick finds and views, and this is an area where we see most of the issues in implementations. And quick finds are normally the first feature that the user will test. So after you go live or after you do an update of a version, normally what the users will do will be to search for the records that they use the most, or their own records, the records that they own. And that would be the first thing that they will do in the user interface. So it's very important for this feature to have a good performance and to be performing well. So in this area, what we provide as best practices is to reduce the number of view columns and find columns. Most of the times, and especially for new customers, what is done is because there isn't any customer data from the start, or there is only a few amount of records. The quick finds will perform well. And this normally what will cause is that when customizing the quick finds, the users will, or the customizers will add a lot of view columns and find columns. And after the data migration, that's when some performance issues may start appearing. So a good tip regarding quick finds is to reduce the number of the view columns and the find columns to what is essential or is required. The other thing is to remove option set attributes from find columns, because those will affect the performance. Also to avoid multiple lines of text. So in most situations, fields like descriptions or titles will be added to the quick finds, and those will cause, whenever someone search for a specific string, that string will be searched on all of the data that is entered on the description field, which will cause also some performance issues. So all of this should be avoided. The other thing is to minimize the number of lookup fields that are added to the quick finds. Those will cause that at the SQL level, a lot of joins will be forced or will be created to support the lookups. So all of this should be taken in consideration when customizing the system for quick finds. Can you move to the next slide? Just confirm when it's done.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize you can't see it.
Yeah, I cannot see the deck right now. So next, the next is improving. Continue on the same topic: how to improve quick finds and views. The other thing is to avoid wildcards. Wildcards usage will severely affect performance. So we have here an example, and this is something that we've seen from our customers, the customers that we are working with. This is quite a common scenario. That is, the users will use wildcards to search, and most common issues will be to search for names. And if you see here on the left on scenario 1, you have a user that will try to search for the last name of, in this case, it can be a contact or an account. So searching for last names, typically the user will use a wildcard. So when using wildcards, this will impact performance, and there isn't any indexes that can be applied to improve the performance in this case. So here you see that the user will search for wildcard and then last name Rogers. And this is because in the quick find, you have the full name field. Instead of having on the opposite, on scenario 2, on the right side, you have on the quick find, you have first name and last name. This will actually cause that when the user will search for the last name, he can simply just search for the last name without having the need of using the wildcard. And we also have already indexes to support these search capabilities. So in terms of results and in terms of performance, the second one in scenario 2 will be much better. So typically you should adjust your customizations, in this case quick finds, to avoid having the need for the users to use the wildcards.
Yeah, I moved it to slide 14 now.
Yeah, thank you, Alok. So still on the same topic regarding quick finds, there is the possibility on the personal options of the user to adjust the number of records per page. This would be the number of records that are returned whenever the user does a quick find. And the higher the value, so the maximum amount will be 250 records, but the maximum the value, the more it will impact on the performance. So basically, you need to figure out a good a number of records that should be returned in terms of performance, and this can require some testing. And the other thing that we have here is that you can apply those settings to all users by using SDK or by using PowerShell scripts. And even enforce, if the user decided to change those values and enforce a specific value by using, for instance, SDK. This will cause that a minimum amount of records will be returned on the first page or per page, which will actually be faster than if they have, for instance, 250 records per page. So this is something that you can adjust, or the user can adjust in the personal options.
Yeah. You're in slide 15 now.
In the next, and this is something that Alok discussed about before, that is regarding the database level and improving in terms of performance. Right now we have a new feature or a recent feature that is available from settings administration, and that is called data performance. So this feature was created for the users or the customers to be autonomous in terms of creating indexes and improving performance. In a SaaS environment, you don't have access to the database. So these kind of features will actually collect the long-running queries, and in this case the threshold is 3 seconds, so all of the queries that will take more than 3 seconds to return data will be shown on this view, and you can optimize the system. And this feature works in the following way. So if you click on optimize, we will implement one or a few indexes that will be needed. And as soon as you implement the indexes, the optimization impact will start counting. So within a few days or a few weeks, we'll have a specific value here that will help you identify if that indexes is really required and what is the impact in terms of performance of the creation of it. And you can, if it's something that it's not having a big impact, you can even remove that optimization and it will remove the indexes. So you have, right now you have two options. You can contact support, Microsoft support, to help you do that analysis, or if it's a very specific scenario, or you can use this as the first approach and try to implement the indexes that are recommended or the optimizations that are recommended by using this feature. And trying to assess if by then the performance issues that you may be facing are now fixed.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you all. So the next topic is around still for quick finds and for views is the ability to enable relevant search. So relevant search is the global search experiences that is powered by Azure search capabilities. That is a feature from Microsoft Azure. The requirement is that a system administration or a user with a system administration role needs to consent this first because of the Microsoft Azure privacy settings. And as soon as this feature is enabled, and we will see that in the following slides as well, but as soon as you enable relevant search, then you will be able to do global searches based on this Azure search feature, which should have better performance. The results should be returned faster, but it will also provide the ability for the user, once this is enabled, the user can switch back to the categorized search by just changing that option that is appearing there on the screen. So basically you can make use of the relevant search, or you can enable it, but you can still use the categorized search. That is what is commonly available without the relevant search enabled. You can use both ways.
Yeah, I've moved it. 17 now.
Yeah, changing the topic to optimize form loading. So this is the other area where we see some performance issues related with solution optimization or with customizations. That is the time that is needed to load forms. And in this case, our suggestions and what we see that it will work best is for you to use the business process flows in combination with the business rules for a better user experience. So these are the features that we have now available to ease the process to create records or to transform the records, to use these business process flows to have an automated way of handling the records. In this case, we see a case, so we can go from the case creation until the case closure and follow all the required steps by using a business process flow. And the business rules will make that experience better by hiding or showing some specific fields according with each stage of the case. The other thing that we have here is the recommendation to display only the necessary fields. The target should be less than 50 fields, no more than that. And that is something that we see in some scenarios, a lot of fields being added, and most of them, they are not needed. So you can even use the business rules to adjust the form according with the requirements. You can also create different forms and having them assigned according with the security rules of the user to avoid adding a lot of fields that are not necessary to the form. The other thing is collapsing tabs. So if you collapse tabs and if you have some fields inside of those tabs, that will ease the process of the form loading, because those fields should only be loaded, or the components that are added on those tabs will only be loaded if that tab is expanded. So you have here that option as well, which you can use. The other thing is not to use too many subgrids. Subgrids is the other aspect of the form loading that will have a big impact, and we see that in some scenarios where there are a lot of subgrids added to a form, that will also delay the form loading. The other thing, and we will see that in more detail. Actually, we'll see that in the next slide. So if you can move it, Alok.
Yeah, I've moved it. Yeah, you're on 18 now.
Yeah. So in slide 18, we have the JavaScript web resources that can be added to the form load or the form save events, but actually to the form itself. And the thing that we see here in most scenarios is that a lot of web resources are added to the form, even if they are not being used. And that is something that we should avoid. So something for you to review on your forms is if all of the web resources related with JavaScript that are added to the form
I think we lost Pedro there. There are some connectivity issues.
Looks like he's calling. There you go.
I'm back. I'm back. Apologies. I think that connection dropped, but I'm back. So I was just explaining that in terms of web resources, in this case JavaScript, you should review them and having only the ones that you are actually using on the form. So moving to slide 19.
Yeah.
Still in terms of form loading optimization, there is a feature called the Performance Center, which you can load by hitting on the Control-Shift-Q, which will actually allow you, when enabled, to assess what objects are taking more time to load and what may be affecting the load time of the form. And that will be helpful in terms of troubleshooting or in terms of understanding what can be improved. So in this case, what we have here is you can see by clicking on the Control-Shift-Q and by opening the Performance Center after being enabled, you can see that, for instance, all the subgrids that are added to the form are taking quite some time, and that will be affecting the complete load of the form. So understanding all of this information that is presented on the screen will actually be helpful for you to be able to understand how you can improve the form load time of your forms.
Okay.
Moving to the next slide, we have the system settings, and on the system settings there are a few options which we can enable or disable depending if you are using them or if you are planning to use them, and those can be helpful to have some gains in terms of performance. So what you can see, first thing is autosave enabled, and autosave, that can be important because autosave, whenever you do some changes on the form, the autosave will be, if it's enabled, it will trigger, it will save the record, and especially if you have plugins or JavaScripts on the onSave event, they will be triggered as well. So if you have it enabled, you may be causing all of those plugins or JavaScript to be triggered several times. If you want to avoid this, you can disable this feature and have it only be triggered whenever the user saves the record. So you might want to analyze all of these settings and try to decide which ones are better in your scenario or in terms of your requirements. The other thing is, if you are not using, or if you don't want to use presence, or if you don't want to have an integration with Skype for Business. So in this case, you can, if you are not using this and if you are not planning to use this, you can disable this feature as well. The other thing is, if you want, whenever a record is shared, if you want that record to be auto-shared with the original user, if you have this option set to yes, the records will be automatically shared with the previous owner, and depending on the cascading options of that record, they will also be reflected to all of the records that are associated with the one that you have shared. And this also have a cost in terms of performance, but also in terms of security. So that might be something that you want to understand if it should be enabled or not. Still on the settings, this is something that we already discussed before. That is the option to enable relevant search to improve the search performance. So you can enable it or disable it from the system settings. The other thing is, if you want to use the integration with Bing Maps. If you have planned to use this, and this can be out of the box in terms of the forms, when you have addresses, you can display them on the map. If you want to use that, you should set it to yes, but if you don't want to use these options, then you can disable them and avoid loading some additional libraries on the form mode. One of the things that I'll explain before in terms of client optimizations as well is the type of form rendering that you may be using. So by default right now, we are using what we call turbo forms, but you can still currently change it back to legacy forms, which will actually not work so well in terms of caching. So if you use turbo forms, then the first load of the day will actually take longer, but the remaining ones, because the information is all cached, it will be much faster. That is the difference, and what I'll explain about cold loading and warm loading. So you can change that options here, and if you still have legacy enabled, then you should absolutely consider changing to this setting to no.
Yeah.
Finally, we have here the information about interactive dashboards and cards, which if you are not planning to use, or if you don't want to have this information expanded, then you can turn that feature off and set it to no. We have some new features for version 9.0 about, and this is basically something that you can adjust. That is the session timeout for the user that used to be enforced, and now it can be configured, and the inactivity timeout as well. So you can set it up according with your requirements and security requirements as well. The other thing, and this is for version 9.0, so if you currently are on version 8.2, you don't have this ability yet, but it will be a new feature on 9.0, that is the ability to enable what we call content delivery network options. By using this, you'll be able to to improve the download performance for static content. So that is something that you should consider if you are planning to move to 9.0, or if you already have like a sandbox instance in 9.0, you can enable this feature for better performance in terms of loading times for static content.
Yeah.
Just pausing it for a bit, check if there are any questions about this part, solution optimizations.
I don't see any.
Okay, if not, then we can move to code optimization. This is the last part in terms of that top-down approach that Alok was explaining. And in the first slide, what we have here is about, in terms of code optimization, is to review if you have plugins, if they can be run asynchronously. And this is something that Alok explained before as well. In terms of plugins execution, if you are running them synchronously, that means that the user needs to wait for the completion of the plugin execution to move to the next step, which is not a good experience in terms of what the user will see on the user interface. So one of the main considerations here is if you are planning to use plugins, or if you have already plugins created, if they can be run asynchronously. The other thing is to use filtering attributes to avoid that the plugins are triggered whenever you change a field which is not part of the plugin logic. And what you have here, for instance, in this case, is an update on the account, and the filtering attributes will be on the account number. This will cause that the plugin will only be triggered if there is an update of the account number field. So this means that the plugin will not just trigger when you update the account, but only when certain attributes are changed. This is the look and feel of the plugin registration tool. So you have here if the plugin is synchronously or synchronous or asynchronous. So you can change depending on what makes sense. The thing is here is to avoid running plugins synchronously, and the other thing is to delete the plugins if they are successful. So if there isn't any error related with the plugin execution, to avoid having a huge amount of records on the async operation base table.
Okay. Yep.
So moving to the next one, in terms of code optimization, is whenever you do retrieve operations, so whenever you are retrieving data from a specific entity, and here we have two examples. We have if you are already using the web API or the OData endpoint, or if you are using query expression. And the main thing here is to avoid returning or fetching all of the columns inside of a table. So here on the first example, we are filtering for 2 columns, and the second one as well. And by default, whenever you do a search, if you don't filter for any kind of fields, then you will be returning the complete list of fields from a specific entity. In this case, if the table is connected, or if it has relationships with other tables, which is the case of the contact or the account of the out-of-the-box entities, you can easily be returning around 100 or 200 columns, which is quite a lot, and you'll be having some delays in terms of fetching that data, which may not be necessary at all. So it depends on your requirements, on your logic. But here the main idea is for you to avoid loading or fetching all of those columns, and only fetching the ones that are strictly necessary.
Yeah.
In the next slide, we have the difference basically between execute multiple requests and single requests. And here, this is, in most scenarios, this is used for data migration. Here what we have is, by default, you have 2 concurrent execute multiple requests, and you can batch 1,000 items. You have here some simulation that was done in terms of the difference between the execute multiple with batches and single requests. And you can see that execute multiple has
in here in this example has a huge difference in terms of performance and in terms of records created. In the same time, you can create much more records. So this is something that you should use, depending on your scenario, of course. This is something that we discuss in depth in the data migration tech talk as well. So if you are interested in this topic, you should attend the data migration tech talk that we have.
Yeah.
In the next slide, we have the keep alive. Basically, this is when you are calling web services from plugins, and by default, keep alive is set to true. By setting this to false, you will allow clients to be aware of connection timeouts, avoiding attempts to use expired sessions, and mostly because we cached all of the information. So you should set this to false by default.
Yeah.
In terms of code execution, same topic that what I was discussed. So we cache plugins instances, so the objects are not exposed. So the main topic here is not to declare or to avoid declaring global variables because they are not threat safety. And you can see here an example. So if you are doing this, you should avoid and you should remove this from your code because since the objects are not exposed, this can lead into some issues that are not intended in your plugin execution.
Yeah.
The last thing here, and again, this is related with not only performance, but also with the user experience. And in this case, by doing synchronous calls from JavaScript, you will cause the user need to wait for the execution to complete before the user can go to the next step. This will also cause some locks on the database level, which should be avoided. So the main thing here is to execute the calls asynchronously, and this is the example that we have here. It should be the one that you can use and you should use, and we have also the documentation with this link that you should follow. Some of these, before going to the conclusions, and I will send it over to Alex, some of these suggestions that we have here are not only related with code optimization and performance optimization, but also with best practices that should be used on your customizations and your solutions. Now, Alex will continue with the conclusions.
Yeah, thanks, Pedro. So I hope you found the content and the topics that we covered useful. So this is typically a level 200 discussion where we try to broadly provide recommendations around the things that you should be aware of when you're designing, so that performance is always a factor that's taken into consideration beforehand, and not something that you think after going live. So there is this performance-weighted awareness that can help you even before go live in your design phase and when you're developing to make sure that you have a solution that will be performing well. So just to conclude and wrap up the things that we covered today, I know we just have a minute. So related to connectivity, what's important is review your data center location, keep track of the latency and the bandwidth, use the tools that you have to test it out, and also try to use the Azure tools or the third-party tools like Thousand Eyes to have a clear view of how the traffic is being routed, where the latency is, and what is the hop count, etc. And closely work with your network teams in optimizing the route to our data centers. From a solution perspective, the key performance challenges come when you're trying to search or find records, or when the forms are being loaded. So focus on the user experience and the key tasks or operations that the users are performing, and work towards optimizing those using the top-down approach that we defined. And then finally, from a development perspective, focus on the number of columns is I think a very, very common recommendation. But even some of the code reviews that I was just involved in a couple of weeks ago, ago, we saw that there was a lot of code where we were retrieving all the columns. So it's really important that, these little things are taken care of, and that can have a major impact on the performance for your end users. And stay away from asynchronous JavaScript calls, because you don't want the user interface to be frozen for your end users after they save the record or the performance specific operation. So I think with these guidance in mind, we can avoid most of the performance challenges. But if you have anything specific, within your solution in a specific area where you're trying to optimize, feel free to, work with your FastTrack program managers, and they can provide you a very tailored guidance to optimize that specific component of a solution and help you improve the experience there. With that, we hope that, you found this content useful, and you're going back with some tips and tricks and some learnings to help improve your overall Dynamics solution and deliver a great experience for your end users. With that, I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes and answer any questions that you might have. Yeah, that's it. And then thanks for attending. And please don't forget to fill out the survey that Debbie will make available for you. Debbie, can you just make sure that that's up so they can respond?
Yep, it is posted.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, guys, while we're waiting for those last few questions, let's go ahead and conclude our recording. So, again, thanks for a wonderful job there. Folks, we would like to call your attention to the survey link. It's posted in the messages window. Click the link, enter your email. You'll be taken into our survey. Our voting scale is on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the best score possible. Be sure to click on the submit button at the bottom to ensure that your feedback has been received. And with that does conclude the recorded portion of today's web conference. The recording will be available at the same registration site within 24 hours. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenters, Alok and Pedro, and thank you, audience, for logging in and joining us today.
Thanks, Debbie.